What happens when one man tries to watch all of the horror films of the 1940s? Well, we're about to find out because I'm your host, Josh Spiegel, and this is the 40s Project. Welcome back to the project, and we are just plugging through this decade because right now we're going to go through all of the horror films of the year 1942, and there's a lot going on right now. The United States is involved in World War II at this point. The Hays Code is going strong, and horror comedies have become all the rage. So let's take a look and see what this entire year has in store.
Let's kick off 1942 with a film that arrived on February 27th, and it's another one from Universal that's not quite a part of the Universal Monsters, and it's The Mad Doctor of Market Street. We meet that doctor right away, and it's that unsung hero of early horror, Lionel Atwill. He's hiring a man off the street to be a part of a new experiment, but whoops, the guy dies, so the police go on the hunt for Doc Nelson. In order to get away, he stows away on an ocean liner headed for New Zealand. That doesn't last long though, because the authorities suspect that he's on board and start their search, which causes him to change his plans and knock the detective overboard. He then just straight up sets the boat on fire, causing everyone to rush to the lifeboats. They end up on an island, including Patricia and her loopy Aunt Margaret, and a guy who's courting her, Red Hogan, which is as much of a 40s hero name as you can get. There's a tribe of villagers on the island that very coincidentally happen to speak English, and it turns out that their queen has died. So Doc Nelson does his experiment stuff and restores her to life. He's declared a god and moves to have the lifeboats destroyed to trap everyone there to continue his work on the other passengers. So, this one was directed by Joseph H. Lewis, and we talked about him a little bit in 1941 as he directed the Lugosi-led Invisible Ghost, but he was mostly a Western-themed director. It was lower budgeted than most of the other Universal horror fare, and made use of a number of actors that they had under contract in order to keep the costs down. At this particular time, mad scientist movies were pretty popular, and Lewis tapped Al Martin to write the script, as he was the same guy who wrote Invisible Ghost. It got so-so reviews, and most commented on how it tended to blend with other Mad Doctor movies from around the same time, with only the Polynesian setting to make it stand out. What's weird is that it had a sort of sequel in the same year with an Abbott and Costello film called Pardon My Sarong. That movie was also set on a remote island where Lionel Atwill plays a mysterious doctor who seems up to no good. He plays Dr. Varnoff there, though, and is likely just meant to be a different character, but the similarities are very apparent. And this is fine, I'll go with a 2.5 on it. It's a case of not much happening, and when it does, it's not very exciting. Its horror-cultural significance is just a 1.5 since it's not spoken of at all, but it was on the Universal roster and featured Atwill, so it gets a tiny bump. Should you watch it? It's probably worth a peek, but it's really nothing special. Just a little while later, on March 6th, we got another one of the Poverty Row entries from Monogram with Black Dragons. It starts with the notice that Honolulu has been bombed by the Japanese, and this is one of the first overt film references to the fact that World War II was going on that we've seen so far. There's been some elements hinting around it earlier, but this is the first time that we've had it overtly brought up. But keep in mind, this is early 42. This is just after the US had formally entered the war. We meet Dr. Melcher, played by Bela Lugosi himself, and so far this year we've had Lugosi and Atwill, so we just need a Karloff appearance, but the doc has a meeting with an American official and seems to attack him, but right after, everything seems normal. Soon after, a dead body is found on the steps of the embassy with a Japanese dagger in his hands, and people begin to notice Uncle Bill's odd behavior. Melcher then continues his reign of terror by swapping out people, revealing that he's teamed up with Japan's Black Dragon Society and the Nazis to try to take down the US. Seems he's actually replacing these people with Japanese agents who have had reconstructive surgery to make them look like those that they're swapping with. And this was by William Nye, who had previously done the 1940 film The Ape with Boris Karloff, and this film was a bit of a rushed production. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1942, they pushed this one ahead and started filming in January in order to get it out in March. At the time, Lugosi was going through a number of issues because he was suffering from terrible arthritis and became addicted to morphine to soothe that pain. In order to support his habit, he had to be working constantly and would jump on any production that would cast him. It did okay when it was released, but is another film that they didn't manage to renew the copyright in time, so it lapsed into the public domain. Because of that, there's a number of unofficial releases of dubious quality out there, with some footage removed. And this is another 2.5. It's duller than I'd like, but some of the plot twists are just so over the top that it's hard to not appreciate it at times. If only the pacing was tighter. Its significance was just a 1 though, because it's basically completely unknown, and were it not for Lugosi, would be lost to time. Should you watch it? It's probably worth a shot just for the goofy aspects. One week later, we had what is likely this year's biggest release, and it arrived on March 13th, and it's the Ghost of Frankenstein. We learned that the specter of the big guy still haunts the village, and we get a recap of Son of Frankenstein, and a reminder that Igor was using the monster to get revenge, and was shot, and the creature was knocked into a pit of sulfur. The villagers all decided to blow the castle up, but I guess that Igor is still alive after all, although they don't say how he managed to survive his wounds. When they blow the place up, it unearths the body of the monster, preserved by the sulfur, and Igor saves him. Oh, and I should mention that Lugosi once again plays the assistants for his second role of the year, but you'll notice that the monster itself looks a touch different. We then meet yet another Frankenstein offspring, Ludwig, son of Henry and brother of Wolf, and he's Cedric Hardwicke, who we recently saw in both The Hunchback of Notre Dame and The Invisible Man Returns. The doc works with Theodore Bomer, played by Lionel Atwill, again for his second film of the year, so he and Bella are tied right now. Igor and the monster stroll into town, and now that we have a good look at his face, you can tell that Boris Karloff did not return to the character. As I stated back when we did Son of Frankenstein, he grew tired of the makeup and weight of the costume and decided not to play him anymore. So the gig was given to Lon Chaney Jr., the new Universal staple. They capture the monster and take him in while Igor tries to convince Ludwig that the problem is the monster's broken brain, and he can fix him by putting in a better one. Meanwhile, I'm not sure why the revised design for the creature has such heavy droopy eyelids, but the monster is also far kinder here, because this is a pretty different take on the Frankenstein franchise, directed by Earl C. Kenton, a director we haven't seen since way back in 1932 with Island of the Lost Souls. He was very busy in between though, although not much in horror. It seems that even though he said that he was done with the role, Karloff did show interest in doing this film, but he was busy filming Arsenic and Old Lace and wasn't available, so they instructed Jack Pierce to make the makeup look as similar as possible to the previous films as to not turn off audiences. Unfortunately, after they cast Chaney, he had a severe allergic reaction to the makeup and had to be out for several days of shooting. It's frequently pointed out that the last film revolved around Igor getting his revenge on the town council and several members being killed off there, although this movie brings those characters and actors back with no explanation as to how they survived. It's also notable for the finale, which gives us sort of a reset for the character. In it, Igor's brain is placed into the monster and even talks, and what's hilarious is that this whole plot point is simply dropped in later films. The reviews were mixed, but it did do quite well keeping the franchise of the Universal Monsters alive and well. And it's fun, but it's a patch on the earlier films. I'll give it a 3. The story gets a touch monotonous, and it's clearly not really trying to do the exploration of morality and such that the series had been doing. Its HCS is also a 3 since it's a part of the original series and still one of the more known entries, but it's nowhere near as influential or regarded as either the original or Bride. Should you watch it? Sure, let this ghost haunt you.
You are Dr. Kettering. I am not Dr. Kettering. I am Igor.
Let's move on now to April 17th, and now we have another one from Universal with The Strange Case of Dr. RX. It begins with the discovery of a dead body with a note on it, signed RX, and the number 5, as it's the 5th murder matching the MO of Dr. RX. Manton Moreland is on hand, who we just saw in Revenge of the Zombies, but Patrick Knowles is here too, and we just saw him in The Wolfman. He's PI Jerry Church, and he's contacted by an old police friend to ask for his help in working on the RX case, but he's not interested. The victims are all connected to the District Attorney Dudley Crispin, as they're all people that he had defended in court, and when he represents another guy who's found innocent, he collapses right after the verdict. He's checked out by a doctor, and that guy looks familiar, and hey, that's Lionel Atwill. So I think I solved this mystery, and that makes movie number 3 for him in this year. After that death, Church agrees to investigate and gets on the trail of the doctor. And crosses paths with his own fiancée, who's played by Anne Gwynn, and we just saw her in The Black Cat. And hey, Detective Hurd has another officer with him that's some kind of stooge. And I'm not sure if a lot of people know that Shemp was famous outside of the Stooges. Like, he left the group in the early 30s and had a solid solo career, but rejoined the trio after Curly had a stroke that prevented him from continuing on around 1947 or so. We find out that another detective that worked on the case went insane, so Church quits, but it looks like even though he's off the case may not be off of him. And this is yet another one from William Nye, who, we just saw 2 movies ago with Black Dragon. And that was from Monogram. And this was Universal, so he had a little bit of a bigger budget to work with here. But it was still done on the cheap. It was also very rushed and started shooting with an incomplete script, and a number of scenes were ad-libbed on the spot, which Gwynn says made the production more fun, even if it ended up making less sense. And here's another interesting note. I already mentioned that Shemp is in this, and a few years later, he'd rejoin the Three Stooges, where he'd continue on until his death in 1955. After his death, while looking for a replacement, Mo Howard really wanted to use Manton Moreland, and was turned down by Columbia Pictures when they insisted on using an actor that they already had under contract. Oh, there's also a gorilla in this, and this is a fun bit because in that suit is a stunt actor named Ray Crash Kerrigan, and he got hired on a number of movies because he owned that suit. We've already seen him in it in 1940's The Ape, and he'd wear it in about 100 flicks. So this one was critically panned and pretty unsuccessful on release, with many saying that Atwill is pretty wasted on such a small role. And this is okay, I guess. I'm going to give it a 2.5. The story's not that good, but it's entertaining enough due to Moreland and Howard and weird ape shenanigans that it's at least amusing. Its significance is just a 1.5 since it's pretty obscure and not many people talk about it, but it has enough recognizable faces for an extra 0.5. Should you watch it? It's worth it for some decent hijinks, but again, the story itself doesn't do much.
Hey, where do you think you're going?
Home?
A little while later, we enter into May, and on the 8th, we have another Monogram production with The Corpse Vanishes. It kicks off with a wedding where the bride just collapses and dies, and her body is stolen away, and it seems as if she's just the latest in a string of similar instances. But there's another wedding about to go on as Alice prepares for her big day, and as she's getting ready, there's a delivery of a rather unusual orchid that she wears. But hey, Bela Lugosi is on hand, and this is his 3rd appearance, so he's once again tied with Atwill. Sure enough, Alice drops dead, and ace reporter Pat Hunter discovers the orchid and notices its unusual scent. Sure enough, Alice's body is stolen away, with Bella foiling the cops with the old E.T. trick. Pamela figures out that the orchid is the common denominator, and Angelo Rossino is here as well, and he and Bella share the screen the previous year in Spooks Run Wild. Turns out that Dr. Lorenz is taking the bodies to his secret lab where he's draining the women of some sort of fluid and injecting it into his wife, which restores her youth and beauty. And I don't know, this must be that whole adrenochrome thing that the sanest people I know on Facebook are always ranting about. Pat follows her leads to Dr. Lorenz's place and begins to unlock his secrets, and this is from a guy named Wallace Fox, and it's his first appearance on the project, but he was pretty busy. But almost all of his work was on Poverty Row films, and he did a lot with Monogram, but not much in horror. Most of his stuff was Western-based. So, Bella was contracted to do 9 movies with Monogram, and this was the 4th of them, and it's probably one of the weirder ones with all the different plot elements that it throws in there. It didn't make much of a splash at the time, but it's since gone on to a different notoriety by being featured in the first season of MST3K, and is still the oldest film to be featured on the show. The episode isn't looked on favorably though, since it's considered one of the duller entries all around, and likely couldn't even be saved by riffing. This is another one that they neglected to renew the copyright on, so it fell into public domain. It could be released by anyone. And I'm just giving this one a 2. It's got some wacky elements in it that seem like they're going to be fun, and then it just doesn't do anything with them, and it's a slog. Its significance is also a 2 since it's fairly unknown, but it ended up getting a little more notoriety than usual thanks to the MST3 connection. Should you watch it? I'd say probably not. It's skippable. Fast forward 1 week to May 15th, and here's another low-budget entry with The Mad Monster. This is set in a swamp, and Doc Cameron here has this wolf all caged up and has drawn some of his blood and has some of the standard bubbling chemical lab. And when you were younger, did anyone ever buy you a chemistry kit, and were you upset that it didn't look like this? Because I certainly was. He also has Pietro here, strapped down to a table, and he's not too bright, and is also played by Glenn Strange, who we'll see in some Frankenstein makeup in the future. And he'd also, of course, going to be a big deal on Gunsmoke. The Doc's formula that he made from wolf blood turns him into Charlie Sheen, or was that the tiger blood? And he instead transforms into a wolfman. The Doc has a hallucination of his former colleagues mocking him and saying his theories were garbage, and he hopes to make wolf soldiers to send into war. And there's an antidote, so Petro turns human again. The Doc also has a daughter named Lenora. Cameron injects Petro again, and this time he heads into the swamps and goes on the attack, sneaking into a house and killing a little girl. After this, Cameron realizes that his plan will work and sends his Wolfman after his old colleagues with the intent to get revenge for spurning his ideas. And this is the first horror entry for this year that's not Universal or Monogram and was released by another Poverty Row company called Producers Releasing Corporation. The director was Sam Newfield, and this guy is considered to be one of the most prolific film directors in history. He directed almost 300 films in his career, and some TV in his later years. The vast majority of his stuff was westerns, and he did a bunch of Billy the Kid themed pictures in some series called The Lone Rider. He didn't do a lot of horror though, but dipped his toes in here and there, and this was his first entry into the genre. It was considered shocking enough in the UK that they banned it and it wouldn't get a release over there until the 1950s, and even then, it had to have a disclaimer at the front. It was frequently tagged as being one of the worst films of all time, and like The Corpse Vanishes, was also featured on MST3K. And this is another 2 from me. Much like the previous film, this has elements that seem like they're going to be cool, and then just doesn't do much with them. It spends a strong amount of time just featuring people sitting around rooms, talking. Its significance is just a 1 since it's virtually completely unknown, and outside of Strange, doesn't have any names to boost it. Should you watch it? You can skip this too. This monster's not mad enough.
Did I walk in my sleep again? Yes. Doctor, ain't there some way you could cure me from doing that? I'm afraid not.
Let's head overseas now, and over in the UK, on June 1st, we have one called The Night Has Eyes, otherwise known as Terror House. We're introduced to a couple of teachers who are planning on heading out onto the moors, even though one of their friends vanished there a year ago. They head out on a train, and as they begin their hike, they run to a man that they met there, and he gives them the heebie-jeebies. They think that he may have been involved with their friend's disappearance. But then a massive storm breaks out, and they're forced to take refuge in the first house they see. But unfortunately, that guy is there too. They sit around and talk to him, finding out that he was in the Spanish Civil War and used to be a pianist, but never recovered from what he saw in combat. Over the course of the night, he's back and forth with being nice and jerky to them, and is secretive about some of the rooms in the house. Over the course of the evening, Marion becomes smitten with Stephen, although she still suspects him, and she may be right, because he has a gun and a signed photo of her in his drawer. The next day, when the storm subsides, Doris decides to go back home, but Marion chooses to stay and figure out the mystery. And this is the rare British horror film that doesn't have Todd Slaughter in it. It was an early work from director Leslie Arliss, who didn't do a ton of film, but then later would shift into TV. And this was based on a novel from 1939 by Alan Kensington. The role of Stephen is played by James Mason, most known for being Humbert Humbert in Kubrick's version of Lolita, and this was right before he became a top box office star. It stirred up some controversy because it was initially rated as being for general audiences, but then suddenly switched to the H for horrific, which meant it couldn't be viewed by anyone under 16. Since the larger scale cinemas wouldn't show H ratings, the film had to settle for the independent market, although it managed to do quite well there, and earned a nice reputation as a character piece. And this is nice. I'll give it a 3. It's a touch slow going, but the mystery works even if it's like a little predictable, and the character stuff is great. Its significance is just a 1.5 since it's still pretty unknown, but it deserves a little boost for featuring Mason just as his name was starting to mean something. Should you watch it? Probably. Put your eyes on this night.
Come here, look. Come here, you little brat.
So that last film was The Night Has Eyes, and the one before that was The Mad Monster. But what if we fused those two for October 20th's Night Monster? This one is set in the posh Kingston Manor, and the servants are very concerned about Lord Ingston and have summoned a doctor for him against his wishes. And one of them is Rolf, once again played by Bela Lugosi from movie number 4 here. He also has a rapey chauffeur and a fortune teller on staff, and there was a killing nearby recently, but the police don't seem all that interested. Unexpectedly, a number of doctors show up, including Doc Harper, who is given a ride by mystery writer Dick Baldwin. Mr. Ingston is an invalid, and some of the doctors that arrived were working with him when his paralysis kicked off, and one of the others is appearance number 4 for Lionel Atwill. So he and Bella are still tied for 4 this year. Ingston reveals that he's had an engineer rig up a complicated system which allows him to move his arms, and then assembles everyone for a demonstration from his yogi, in which he makes a skeleton appear. Later, as everyone prepares to go to bed, bodies start to pile up, leaving little pools of blood on the floor. And this is yet another entry from Universal, and they were really rocking the horror world this year. And the director was Ford Beebe, and this is another guy who was crazy active and dipped a bit more into the serial world, and did some Flash Gordon movies, Buck Rogers, and The Green Hornet. This is the first thing that really lands as horror though, but we'll see him again in the coming years. Much like Dr. X, Atwill plays a small role here, as does Bella for that matter, doing side characters, even though they're both given top billing. It's considered to be a loose remake of Dr. X, even if it's not billed as such, because of some very similar plot points, although they do feel like rather different tales. And this is decent, but it's a 2.5. It just feels like either Dr. X or Dr. RX or whatever, and it's just a toned back version of it that's less interesting, but it's enjoyable enough. Its significance is a 1.5 also, since it's another that's not really talked about, but with Lugosi and Atwill, even in a lighter capacity, it deserves a little boost. Should you watch it? Maybe. It's okay and all, but it's another that you won't be missing much without.
What's the meaning of all this commotion? Miss Instant must be allowed to sleep. Do you hear what I say?
You're the only one making any noise. Shut up.
Just 2 days later, on October 22nd, looks like things were gearing up for Halloween as we got this next one, The Boogeyman Will Get You. We're down on a farm and hey look, it's finally Karloff! He was all over the previous 2 years, so it's wild that it took him until October here to appear. He's Professor Billings and he's selling his tavern to Winnie here, and the only catch is that his lab is there, and she agrees to let him stay there for a while to finish his experiments. Turns out, though, that his experiments involve putting people in this contraption and whoops! Accidentally killing them. Then, Peter Lorre stops in, and it's his first appearance here this year as well, and I think he's supposed to be a bad guy, but he carries around a kitten with him, so he's my favorite character. Winnie has an ex that's trying to win her back, and really taking her ditching him well.
All right, I'm through. I hope you starve.
The inn gets a resident right away, but then it appears as if there's some spooky things happening. And when the doc's murderous streak is uncovered, he says he's trying to create a superhuman, and that the dead men are still there in spirit, and they form an alliance with plans to continue the experiments. And hey, look, another studio jumps in here, since this one was from Columbia, and was the final film of Karloff's contract with them. The reason why he was absent from the screen so much here is because this is when he was doing a very successful stage run of Arsenic and Old Lace, and this script was cobbled together to have some similarities to that. Lou Landers was the director, the same guy who worked with Karloff back in 35 with The Black Cat. Beyond that, it also jumped on the horror comedy bandwagon by having a sillier sensibility to it. One tidbit is that Winnie is played by Jeff Donnell, and they've made sure in the credits to credit her as Miss Jeff Donnell so that people wouldn't be confused. The actress's real name was Jean, but she was a big fan of Mutt and Jeff comics, and her nickname became Jeff as a small child, and she ran with it as a stage name. The reviews for it were a bit mixed though, and it did fine, but later discussion of the film noted that it was about a madman trying to create a race of Supermen. And considered that the war was raging on at this point, it's seen as a vague parody of Hitler. And it's decent. I'm going with a 3. It's really more like a 2.5, but Karloff and Lorre play off each other so well that it raises it a bit. Its significance is a 2 since it's not all that well known, but with 2 of the genre's biggest stars in such prime roles, it gets a little extra oomph. Should you watch it? Sure. Did I mention the cat?
Huh? Certainly, all of them. Will $50 be sufficient? I mean, $20? 20? Oh.
A mere 1 day later, on October 23rd, we get one more bigger entry with another Universal Monster saga, and it's The Mummy's Tomb. This one starts with some wild time bending since we have the character of Steve Banning from The Mummy's Hand, once again played by Dick Foran, but he's much, much older now, and he recounts the events of the last film, and it's said to be 30 years later, which is wild because that either resets the events of that one to the 1910s or sets this one in the 1970s. There's also footage from the first movie to recap that one, and it's actually a full 11 minutes worth. And this movie is only an hour long, so around 1/5 of this movie is recycled footage. We're told that Marta has since passed away, and somehow Endoheb, the high priest, has survived his fate, and he passes on the instructions for reviving the mummy to his follower, Mehmet, before dying of old age. He uses the Tana leaves to bring back Karis in order to get revenge on Banning and his team, and we get a good look at Mr. Bandage. He certainly looks a bit different, and that's because much like we saw with Ghost of Frankenstein, the role was taken over by Lon Chaney Jr. His first victim is Banning himself, and an early example of the horror staple of bringing back your hero from the last film to kill them off, and that just leaves his descendants to take out to complete his revenge. And as we've covered, this is the next chapter in the Mummy saga, which had a long gap between the first and second entries, but not so much here since there was just a 2-year break. The directing job was given to Harold Young, and it's one of his only jumps into the world of horror outside of a TV movie from 1961. Before this, he had mainly worked in England, and this was his crossover into American film, and afterwards he'd stay in the B-movie world. Chaney took on the Mummy role, mainly because he just had renewed his contract with Universal, and they were keen to hype him up as their new horror star. And it's interesting to think that when you think of the Universal monsters, you picture the big four. You got Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, and the Mummy, and in the space of about a year, Chaney has now portrayed 3 of them. The weirdest aspect is that 30-year time jump, especially because the film ends with John Banning getting notice of having been sent off to duty in World War II, so it seems like they're retconning the Mummy's hand to take place in the early 10s. And this wasn't as beloved by critics, and a number of the reviews talked about how much the plot is almost the same as the previous film. It doesn't offer much new, but it still did very well at the box office, ensuring that Universal would bring the Mummy back several more times, as we'll see as we get further into the decade. And those critics were right. This is probably the least of the Mummy sequels, so I'll go with a 2.5. It's just a repeat of the same stuff we saw in the last one, and it makes us sit through 11 minutes of old footage. Its significance is a 3, though, since it's part of one of horror's biggest franchise, even if it's a lesser-known entry, but just being a part of the Universal Monster Saga gives you an edge. Should you watch it? Probably, just for the ties to the franchise and to see the silly old age makeup. One week later, a day before Halloween, there was yet another Monogram picture with October 30th's Bowery at Midnight. It starts with a criminal on the run, and he attacks a guy and steals his clothes. He finds out about a local soup kitchen that's run by, well, it's Monogram, so it has to be Bela Lugosi for appearance number 5 for 1942. And he was just burning through that contract, isn't he? Turns out that Wagner has ulterior motives and is using the kitchen as a front and recruits that guy as one of his henchmen, but then kills him. Wagner has a double life, though, because he's also a meek psychology professor who's married as a sort of a secret identity. When another criminal ends up in his kitchen on the run from police, he ends up in Wagner's employ, and he has him shoot the guy that normally does his shooting of guys. We're also introduced to good guy John Archer, who's one of the professor's students, and he's engaged to Judy, who works in the kitchen, but doesn't seem to know about the crime stuff. And yeah, working for Wagner seems to suck, because you never know when he's just going to randomly chuck you off a building. And if this seems like a standard crime thriller with no horror elements, well, it is, until the last 10 minutes or so, when the horror stuff finally comes into play with zombies. And not only is this another one from Monogram with Lugosi, but it's also handled by Wallace Fox, the same guy who did The Corpse Vanishes. The company had success with their Bela-led features, so they were eager to shoot more, and they announced a couple of films called Night of Horror and Torment, but then came out with this one instead. The film had some weird notoriety in that it was re-released in 1949, where it was more successful than its initial run and became a minor hit. It then got a lot of TV airplay and has a strange part of television history because the very first ever episode of Late Night with David Letterman ended with a comedian simply reciting dialogue from this film from memory as the closing credits ran. And this is okay. I'll go with a 2.5. It's just way too long before they get to the interesting zombie stuff, but there's some fun bits here and there, just not enough to get it up to a 3. Its significance is a 1.5 because it's still pretty unknown and not much talked about, but it does have a handful of odd things in its history to give it a slight boost. Should you watch it? It's a toss-up. It's entertaining enough, but it's not really essential.
Bowery at Midnight with Bela Lugosi, John Archer, and Wanda McKay.
You shouldn't smoke that. It might stunt your growth.
All right, you got it. Go ahead, smoke it.
I'm saving it for after dinner.
You shouldn't smoke that. It might stunt your growth. If you gotta go ahead and smoke it. I'm saving it for after dinner.
As we move on to November 7th, a new player has entered the ring for the year as Warner Brothers release The Hidden Hand. This opens up with an insane asylum inmate escaping because of the least observant police officers known to man, and tags along with them as they go to visit his sister in her big spooky mansion. Lorinda's servant is Eustace, played by Willie Best, who's really had a surge here in the 40s as the whole horror comedy thing took over. They think that John will return home, and they're right, but he's been expecting him, and she's planning on testing her relatives who all want her money, and she wants him to help her with her plan. He poses as her new butler, and all the family members arrive and tragedy starts to arise, like their bird is poisoned, and as her test begins, she pits people against each other while John gets excited about killing more, and during everything, Lorinda is declared dead. But when other bodies start showing up, it seems like John is up to his old tricks? Or is he? And like I said, this is from Warner Brothers, and they weren't heavy into the genre, but still did their fair share of low-budget flicks, and this was one of them. The director was Benjamin Stoloff, and we haven't seen him since way back in 1933 with Night of Terror, but he didn't do much horror, and only did a few films after this one. It's also based on a play, which feels pretty apparent when you're watching it with the locations and staging. The stage version was on Broadway and actually featured Humphrey Bogart and Walter Abel. And I like this. It's a 3. The comedy elements don't overshadow the plot, and the whodunit aspect is actually pretty fun, and you're never quite sure how much of it was all set up. The HCS is just a 1 though, since it's very unknown, and with the exception of Willie Best, doesn't feature much in the way of known faces. Should you watch it? Sure. Don't let this hand remain hidden. A little later on in the month, on November 27th, right around Turkey Day, we go back into Monogram Land with The Living Ghost. This one has a man named Walter Craig, a successful banker, who's gone missing. The family decides to call in a private detective named Nick Train. He's said to be the best. When they go to meet him, though, he's a bit of an oddball, also working as a phony psychic, and is retired from detective work, but gets convinced by the family. He goes back to the estate to talk to everyone on the grounds, and on his first night there, Mr. Craig reappears, sitting in his chair, only he appears to be a zombie. Nick gets down to solving the crime with his goofy charm, and when a dead body appears with Craig standing over him, the plot thickens. That body continues to move around, always looking to attack someone, and it's up to Nick to figure it all out. And like I said, this is another Monogram picture, but one that didn't feature Bela Lugosi, and it's clear that they were heavily inspired by the wave of horror comedies that were happening thanks to The Cat and the Canary. It was based on an original tale from Howard Dimsdale that was titled Money for What, and then adapted into a film version. William Bodine directed, and this guy has 400-some directing credits, but a lot of those were TV episodes, so it wasn't as prolific as some of these other guys who directed hundreds of feature films. And this is the first that we're seeing him, but he'd been directing since 1915, so he was firmly entrenched in the film world, but didn't do much in the way of horror. It said that the budget was extremely low, in the $15,000 to $20,000 range, as a number of Monogram films were, significantly lower than those from the other studios. When it was released, it was given negative write-ups as being rather standard and just following all of the cliches of similar films from the era. It was also released under a number of titles, including Lend Me Your Ear and A Waking Nightmare. And I find this to be pretty meh. I'll give it a 1.5. It's basically like watching one of any number of the others that I've watched, but with less charm and anything interesting. Its significance is just a 1 since it's never spoken of and has no names attached, leaving no impact on the genre. Should you watch it? This is a pretty easy skip.
I'm the sympathetic listening ear around here, Jeeves.
I beg your pardon, sir.
Okay. Why must there be a butler in every murder mystery?
On that very same day, November 27th, there was a little higher budgeted entry, but still a lesser known name, with The Undying Monster. It tells us about the cursed Hammond House and the Hammond Monster that besieged all the owners of the house. Time passes, though, and the current owners discount all that as mere superstition, and damn, look at this place. I know that I should be in awe of how big this manor is, but all I can think about right now is how insane that air conditioning bill must be. But then it appears as if there is indeed something on the loose outside, howling away as it attacks. Oliver manages to fight it off, but his lady friend is in a coma, and he says that he and Helga are the last remaining Hammonds alive, and they declare that it's likely that the Hammond beast has returned. Meanwhile, there's a Scotland Yard scientist and his wacky sidekick, and they're brought on board to solve the case. They all go to the big house, and weird stuff starts right away as they hear rattling chains, and there's a whole ass crypt in the cellar. But uh-oh, it looks like the servant staff knows a little more than they're letting on. Seems like there's motive to go around, since if Oliver dies, Helga becomes the sole heir to the estate. And we have a new player on hand, since this is the very first release of the year in horror from 20th Century Fox. And it's by John Brom. And it's the first and likely only time we'll see him here, since the entire rest of his filmography avoids horror stuff. It's said that the role of Bob Curtis was originally meant to be played by George Sanders, and Fox had to suspend filming when he ended up refusing it. It's said that he said yes, but then was instructed by the studio to show up for work dressed as a gorilla, and then he just said no thanks. I guess this caused him to have to do some reshoots, but they were able to get it all together to get it out as a part of a double bill with a mystery film called Dr. Renault's Secret. And what's wild about this one is that it sort of ends up being a Wolfman knockoff, even if it never really commits to it. And this is okay. It's a 2.5. It looks nice, and I dig that it's doing something different, but the setup to this film feels so far removed from the finale and takes way too long to get there. Its HCS is a 1.5 since it's not very well known, but has a small cult following and is another early werewolf film, so it has that. Should you watch it? I actually think this is skippable. This year ends with a film that debuted in New York on December 5th, but got a bigger rollout on the 25th. Christmas Day in 1942 goes out with Cat People. We meet Oliver here, and he's at the zoo where he notices a young woman named Irina sketching a Black Panther, and he goes to talk to her, and they go back to her place. She says that she's only recently arrived in America, and they hang out all day, with her telling him that she's from Serbia. But this isn't a Serbian film. And they make a date to see each other tomorrow. He buys her a cat, and who does that? You met a girl yesterday, and then you randomly just bring her a cat? Here you go, person I met 24 years ago. Here's a 20-year commitment. Enjoy. The kitty hates her, so they swap it out for a bird, and that night they each say they love each other, and damn it, people, what part of 24 hours ago are you not getting? She then says that she's a descendant of cat people, but he doesn't believe her, and they get married. And at the wedding, a strange woman walks up to Irina and calls her sister. She asks him to wait to consummate their marriage because she's afraid if she gives in to her passions, then she'll become a cat. But then trouble arises when Oliver's assistant, Alice, confesses that she's in love with him, which Irina finds out about and sure isn't pleased. Soon, something is stalking Alice in the swimming pool, growling like a big cat, and it seems like there may actually be more to Irina than meets the eye. And this was from Frenchman Jacques Tourneur, and produced by Val Lewton, who had just moved into producing for RKO Pictures to make B movies. He was given a budget of $135,000 to work with, and he selected the crew from people he had worked with under a previous producer. He was simply given the title Cat People and had to work with a concept around that, and Tourneur took the concept and fleshed it out, even though he was unhappy with the given theme. The beginning of filming was rough because one of the executive producers saw early rushes and called Lewton and told him to fire the director, but the producer sent footage to another of them and he loved it, so Tourneau was kept on. But problems continued as higher-ups at RKO weren't happy with it either, and there was a lot of questions about how to handle the film. Reviews weren't great either, with critics being wildly split. However, the film was a nice hit, becoming one of RKO's biggest performers, with some saying it made as much as $4 million at the box office. A success led to a sequel in 1944 called Curse of the Cat People, and the look of the film would influence a number of imitators. There was also a remake in 1982, also called Cat People, that sort of follows the same basic plot, but expands on it quite a bit. There's also a pseudo-sequel called The Seventh Victim, which was co-written by DeWitt Bodine, the writer of this film, which featured vague references to this one to tie it in. And I love this. It's a solid 4, and the one thing that this nails is the mood. All of the atmosphere is gorgeous, and it builds tension amazingly. The difference between this one and a number of other films on this list is vast in terms of execution. Its significance is a 3.5 though, since it had a big influence on filmmaking, but this is not one of the more known films out there. I think it's been seen quite a bit, but nowhere near on the level of some of its contemporaries. Should you watch it? Of course, there's multiple cats, so you'd be silly not to.
So there you have it, all of the horror of 1942. And I think my favorite of this block was clearly Cat People. It's just such an interesting surprise of a film. It's so well shot and so well done that I really like it. Let me know if you like that one as well, or what your favorite of this block was, or which of these you've seen or haven't seen. Tell me that in the comments below. If you liked the video, hit that like button. If you enjoy the channel, hit subscribe. And also check out my Patreon page at patreon.com, where you can help support the project and keep it going. But yeah, we're going to see you very shortly with 1943, the entire year, right here on the 40s Project.